Good morning, and welcome to this podcast sponsored by SCORE and the Chamber of Commerce here in Lebanon. Our guest today is Jason Mundok, and he is a media producer, podcaster, musician, and co-host of So Good Media's Lancaster-Lebanon Jays. He produces audio podcasts, marketing videos, and other original programming for the company, and he's co-founder of So Good Lancaster. And he started years ago with 4-track recordings. He's moved to digital recording and finally to podcast. We're delighted to have Jason here with us today. I will tell you a little about SCORE. We are here in Lancaster, or in Lebanon. Karen Grove has been gracious to offer and give us an office here in the chamber. So we provide free business mentoring to anyone who's interested in starting a business or who has a business and needs some help. We have 80 volunteers here in the Lancaster-Lebanon area to help you. Now, again, all of this is free. If you'd like to reach out and request a business mentor, you can go to www.lancasterscore.org. Okay, enough of that. Jason, it's all yours.
Thank you, Jared. It's great to be with you all this morning. Hello to everybody who's online. My name is Jason Mundok, as Jared mentioned. The question that we're going to answer this morning is, should your business have a podcast? Throughout the talk, we're going to explore what a podcast is. We're going to talk about how to think about planning for a podcast, and then the benefits of using a podcast in the business space. But first, I'm going to expand a little bit on the first question, which was, who I am. Stand by just one moment.
Go ahead, try it.
All right, there we go. So, as Jerry mentioned, I'm a podcast host and producer. I got into the podcast game many years ago, around 2010, 12 years ago. Podcasting was, I guess, sort of in its infancy at that time. But I got in early. I also produced a lot of marketing video with the company So Good Media. And my background, though, comes from the music world. I was an audio engineer for many years and spent the last 30 years or so writing and recording music. So my background started with music and evolved over time through audio production, through recording studios, and into this world of digital media and digital podcasting where we are today. But I'm also a software developer. I've spent about 20 years now developing software for small businesses. And so it's a unique set of experiences that allow me to think about audio production and podcast. They used to be very different. They used to be very separate. You produce audio, especially with music, and then build business applications for small business, and those two things didn't overlap very frequently, but they are overlapping now with the popularity of podcasting. So,
Oh, I don't know why it's not. Sorry.
Here we go. So Good Media is a small company that I co-founded with my partner Ann Kirby in Lancaster, and is also the founder of the Candy Factory, which is a co-working and social club in downtown Lancaster. It's been around for 12 years now. Over the past couple of years, we've ramped up our media production. COVID certainly expedited that, as more and more of the members of the Candy Factory co-working space were interested in live streaming and interested in taking advantage of the internet and being able to be remote and do things like conference presentations or marketing videos and marketing live streams and things of that nature. So we took advantage of that with our members and really expanded the we expanded our technology in the Candy Factory, and that led to this new company called So Good Media that we launched last year. Our goal is to provide really high quality web marketing media assets, but without breaking the bank, because we've worked for decades in the small business space. We're small business owners ourselves. Most of our clients are small business. So we understand that small business has a budget, and we have to work within the constraints of that budget. So we're trying to balance taking advantage of all this technology and all this access to customers through digital means, but do it on a small business budget. So that's the mission, if you will, the vision of So Good Media.
I don't know why that keeps doing that. I'm sorry.
Not a problem. So for today's conversation, I'd like to frame the conversation around around defining what a podcast is, because that term gets thrown around a lot. A lot of different types of media are called podcasts. But for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to talk about audio in particular, an audio program that is hosted on the internet and is published through what are called aggregators. So throughout the rest of this talk, when I reference a podcast, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an audio program hosted on the internet, accessible through the internet, and published through what are called aggregators. Now, if that word aggregator doesn't mean anything to you, it's Apple Podcasts, it's Google Podcasts. You may have heard of Stitcher, the most popular platform, at least the hot platform right now is Spotify. So those are aggregators. There's basically apps on your phone or on your tablet or websites you can visit on your computer where you can browse, find, subscribe to, and listen to podcasts. What we're not going to be talking about today are video series, like a YouTube video series or a social media video series. So if somebody is creating essentially a television program and publishing it through YouTube, that's not what we're talking about in the context of this conversation, or social media videos like Facebook video series and that sort of thing. We're talking specifically about audio. So I want to start with some basics on how do you make a podcast. And this is a pretty high level discussion of how you do it. We're not going to get into the technical aspects of it. This is more of the planning of a podcast and the different things you need to think about when you're planning or thinking about making a podcast. With a lot of the folks that we work with through the co-working space who are interested in podcasts and media, we use a who, what, where, when, why, and how process. So we're going to apply that basic kind of old school, news approach to this idea of making a podcast. We talk about starting with the who. Who is going to be on the podcast? So if I'm planning to present something in podcast form to the world, the first thing I need to think about is who's going to be actually on it. How many voices? Is this me, a solo voice who is providing information to my audience? Is this a conversation that I'm having with a partner or multiple hosts, sort of a round table that are the same voices each time? Or is this a podcast that interviews guests and provides a platform for other people to share their expertise? Those are three basic models for who is going to be participating in this podcast. And they're all different. And of course, podcasts can mix and match those. But it is more common to pick a format and stick with that format. What would be the kind of podcast? So what is it that we're trying to, that we're presenting to our audience? Is this topic-driven information? Is this information that, I pick a topic that has something to do with my expertise and I present a show or an episode on that topic? Or is this a debate? Is this some sort of a question that we're putting out into the universe, and then we're going to bring different perspectives to that particular topic? And then other logistical considerations need to be thought about, like how long should this podcast be? Is this a long form podcast, which would typically run an hour or more, or is this a short podcast, something that we're going to do a quick hit, or is this a medium-sized podcast, like a 30-minute podcast? There's a lot of different reasons why you would pick those different lengths, and I have my own personal opinions about what I feel works the best under certain situations, but it's ultimately to the listener. And so you need to take those considerations into account, but also take, of course, your audience and the type of person who's going to be consuming this podcast to determine how long that podcast should be. So what is really a description of the podcast? Where? So where are you going to not just record it, but where are you going to publish it? So we'll start with the physical where. Is this a podcast that will be recorded online? With the pandemic over the last couple of years, we've all gotten a lot more comfortable with the idea of Zoom podcasts, we'll call where you see two squares or multiple squares. The Brady Bunch is what we refer to it in now. The Brady Bunch look, where you have squares and talking heads. Even the news, right? The major news outlets went from people sitting around a table to squares on a screen. And so we've gotten very comfortable with that. So your podcast could certainly be recorded online. And that opens you up to interviewing if you want to have guests on your podcast, or even a dialogue, a roundtable type dialogue. It opens you up to anywhere in the world you can bring guests in from. Is your podcast going to be recorded on site somewhere? So are you going to actually visit different places to record the podcast? That's also a common approach, or in a studio. And when I say studio, that doesn't necessarily mean a professional recording studio. You could simply have a studio set up in your office or in your home where you're recording your podcast. One of the great advances in technology, especially in the media production space over the last 20 or 30 years, is the access to inexpensive, high-quality equipment. You can build a podcast studio for well under $1,000 that is very, very professional sounding podcast studio and create broadcast quality media on an extremely reduced budget versus going back 30 years where you need to outfit for $10,000. So where are you going to be recording that podcast is an important consideration. Now, when is it going to come out? Let's talk about the frequency. Weekly, bi-monthly, monthly, these are all common patterns for podcasts. I would say that a weekly podcast is probably the most common when it comes to entertainment podcasts. It follows the tradition of a weekly television program or weekly radio program, syndicated radio programs. But if you're a small business owner and you're trying to make a podcast for your marketing purposes, that might be a little aggressive to try to publish a weekly podcast. You can certainly publish a podcast on a bi-monthly or monthly basis and have it still be very effective. We'll talk about that a little bit later, about the benefits of creating a podcast for your business. The most important thing to think about when it comes to frequency is consistency. Not necessarily how often you're publishing it, but how consistently you're publishing it. Because there's one thing an audience is looking for, is consistency. It's developing patterns around the consumption of this media. So if it's weekly and they know it's going to come out every Wednesday, your audience will begin to look forward to that podcast, just like you do. Again, we've been trained by the entertainment industry over the years to follow these patterns. It's changing, of course, with things like Netflix and binge watching, where a whole season comes out of once. But for most of us who spent decades consuming media, we're used to these patterns on a publishing schedule, and so podcasts are really no different. And is your podcast episodic or serial? So what that means is an episodic podcast means that you can jump into that podcast on any episode and get value from it. Very topic-driven podcasts are most often episodic. You don't have to listen to them in a particular order. Whereas a serial podcast is designed specifically to follow a pattern. They're very linear programs. So serial podcasts the intention is you go back to the beginning, you start at the first one, and then you listen through, and the information builds upon itself. Next is why. So why is it that you are making this podcast to begin with? Is it to position yourself as an expert? Is it to provide case studies for the business that you provide or the services you provide? Or is it simply for entertainment purposes? You have to be clear on the why, because that why will help answer several of the other questions, like how frequent, who your audience is going to be, how your audience is likely to consume that information. So being clear on the why is very important. And of course, there are a variety of whys, not just the ones I have listed here, but these are the most common when it comes to small businesses creating podcasts. How will you produce it? You can produce a podcast yourself. Again, the advances in technology has given us a tremendous amount of access to technology that we can use, build studios in our homes, build studios in our offices, and create very, very high quality, professional broadcast quality podcasts. Or you can have it professionally produced. So you can certainly hire media companies like So Good Media or any other media company that has the equipment, has the experience, and can do all of the production work that's required. So after you sort of learn how all of this works, that may help you make that decision. Do I really want to learn how to do these skills or how to create this and acquire these skills, or do I want to hand that off to somebody else? Not unlike most things in small business, right? We have to learn eventually to delegate if we want to grow. So same thing with podcasting. Now I'm a tinkerer, right? I would have been the AV club kid back in the 80s messing around with video cameras and stuff. So I would be interested in that, but you may not be, so you may want to outsource that. So when it comes to the actual creation of the podcast, really podcast and any media production follows the same pattern of pre-production, production, and post-production. Seems very simple, but we think about media, the creation of that episode or that asset under these three distinct areas. Pre-production would be scheduling, lining up your resources, learning about your resources that are going to be participating in the podcast. So if I'm doing an interview, I want to learn about in advance about my guest, learn about their background, so that your audience isn't listening to you introducing yourselves for the very first time. That can be pretty stale. So you want to do your research and plan ahead. That all falls under the pre-production area. Even if you're outsourcing your podcast to a studio, the pre-production part is your responsibility if you're the creator or the host of this podcast. Scripting, if you're solo and you're just disseminating information, you should script that information. So have that all prepared and planned when you go into record, or plan out your questions in advance. There are some differing philosophies on whether or not you want to provide those questions to a guest in advance. You kind of lose the magic and the spontaneity sometimes of the conversation if it feels too canned. But some folks also lean toward, well, you don't want to necessarily surprise your guest either, so you want to give at least some information about what you're talking about. I like to sit right in the middle of that. I like to talk about the topics I would like to cover with my guest, but I'm also going to do some research and find out some of those magic moments, some of those key milestones maybe in my guest's career or path, so that I can present those questions or a question about that in a unique way in the moment. That's all part of pre-production. So that's all the planning leading up to creating the asset. The production itself is where you might want to consider outsourcing or not. And that is, buying or setting up the equipment, learning the technology, and actually physically recording your podcast. And then finally, there's post-production. And this is the part that's often overlooked or not considered when you're jumping into the game. You just think, oh, I'm going to line up my guests and I'm going to record it, and it's magically done. Not the case. Post-production arguably is the most important piece when it comes to creating a high quality product, and that is editing, creating any kind of graphics or copy that will complement the podcast, and then ultimately publishing it. The editing piece, most importantly, it's very, very difficult to create something on the first take, or create something that doesn't need any kind of post-production editing, whether it's audio or video. And so learning how to edit, learning how to cut out certain parts that didn't really work that well, learning how to move parts of your podcast episode, the audio around, is critical to creating a very compelling podcast episode. So that's all set up for how you would plan, ultimately just create the vision or the mission for your podcast, plan it, and then some information on how you would actually produce it. So let's take that context now, all that we've talked about so far, and apply it back to the ultimate question of today's conversation, which is, should I make a podcast for my business? As you probably are recognizing through the last couple of slides, it's not simple to make a podcast. Not terribly complicated, but it also isn't as simple as some other ways of marketing or sharing information around your business. This slide here represents something that I learned many years ago about. It was in the context of positioning. And to give you a little bit further context about this slide, positioning the positioning of business essentially comes with choosing the types of ways that you're going to disseminate information or market your business. Some ways of marketing a business take an incredible amount of effort. but have a huge return. And some things that you do to market your business can happen in a few seconds or a few minutes and might have less return. So I was participating in a conversation with a positioning expert many years ago, and he provided me with a spreadsheet, and that spreadsheet had a list of hundreds of different things that you could use to market your business. But the list was sorted by the most bang for your buck. And as you would expect, the things that had the most bang for your buck, the items that were sorted at the top, also involved the most effort. I thought it was really fascinating. And his advice was, this positioning expert's advice was to make sure, sort of like a financial portfolio, make sure that your marketing efforts are arduous. So pick one or two things that have a big bang that take a lot of effort, and pick a few things that don't take a lot of effort, and don't have that big of a return. And build a portfolio of marketing that is balanced, so that you're not spending all of your time on these one or two things that take a lot of effort, but you're also not just creating mountains of disposable content that don't really return, don't really provide a lot of return on your efforts. So I took a few of the things that have to do with marketing that are probably the most common, at least in my mind, in terms of small business marketing, and I put them in two columns. The one on the left is big effort, big bang, and the one on the right, less effort, less bang. So you could write a book, you could publish that book, positioning yourself as an expert in your field, probably going to take a while. That would be a considerable effort, especially if it's if it's a book of great substance with great detail. But if you have published a book, especially if you published a book through a publisher versus self-publishing a book, right, which takes even more effort, you're going to be immediately taken seriously in many circles. So that sits at the top of my list. So if you follow that list down to the bottom, a consistently published audio podcast would be considerably less effort than writing a 200, 300 page detailed book about your industry or your expertise, but still requires quite a bit of effort. On the right-hand side, less effort, less bang. So writing a blog post is certainly effective. It's going to take you a lot less effort to write a blog post and publish it on the internet than it is to write and record and have a podcast edited. All the way down to social media posts, which you can literally do while standing in line at a grocery store. But that social media post is a bit like a twig floating down a creek. If you don't happen to be looking at the creek at that moment and you don't see that twig, it's gone in the infinite scroll that is social media. So while you do want to take advantage of some of these quick hit methods for marketing your products or services, you also want to balance that with some of the things on the left. And so podcasting sits kind of right in the middle there, but definitely less effort than speaking at a conference, creating a high quality video series, but it does take effort. But the return can be very large indeed. We're looking for some yeses on these questions. So let's just say you've gotten this far, you've said, okay, none of this scares me. All sounds very reasonable. I get the whole idea of planning. I'm a planner. I like to organize my efforts. Maybe I'm interested in audio. Maybe I have a great studio that I can hire. And you've decided that this audio podcast fits within your marketing portfolio. And you've decided that you want to move forward. I would next advise that you ask these questions. And we want to find some yeses on this list. The first one, are you comfortable presenting information? So one of the other things that positioning expert advised me when I was talking to him many years ago is you can also, when you're deciding which of these high effort, high return items to use in your marketing portfolio, make sure that they fit your strengths. Because if you don't like to be in front of people, or if you don't like the sound of your own voice, which is question number 2, if that makes you uncomfortable, then maybe writing that book does make more sense than speaking at a conference or creating an audio podcast. So you need to be comfortable presenting information. You need to not get nervous when the red light goes on and it's time to record. So make sure that you have some yeses in under those 2 questions. Next are a little bit more about the industries and the customers that you're serving. Are you in a niche industry? And would your customers care about extra knowledge? So when you think about a podcast, and you think about non-niche industries, like say a pizza shop. Now, I'm not going to say that a pizza shop couldn't have a successful podcast. But if someone was talking, casually asking, do you think I should make a podcast and I have a pizza shop? I'm not sure that how compelling making a podcast for a pizza shop would be in terms of marketing. Everybody pretty much knows what they're going to get. Most even small towns have more than one option for a pizza shop. Of course, we have specialized pizza for all the pizza. I don't want to start getting hate mail here. You get what I'm saying? But the point is that if it's not a niche industry like a pizza shop, I'm not sure what information my customers are going to want or care about when it comes to extra knowledge that would entice me to tune in and listen to this podcast about the pizza that I'm making. You could say, okay, right, if I'm really, really getting geeky into the specifics of how to create wood-fired pizza or something like that, then there certainly is pizza podcasts out there. But that's an important question to think about. Would my customers care about extra knowledge? Another one I think about often when I'm talking about this and looking, for example, something like an appliance, right? So, I have to buy a washer and dryer every so many years, less and less, of course, as we move through time. But so when I go out and I can make a purchase like that, I'm hoping it's a one-time purchase. It's not something that I really need extra knowledge about, and it's not a recurring purchase for me, right? So when we talk about, are you providing a service or a product that requires education? Once I know how to use my washer and dryer, I'm pretty much done. That's not something that I would necessarily tune into a podcast to learn more about, right? Buying appliances or having those things installed. Examples where that would be the case would be something around, say, consulting or coaching, or these are methods for achieving something, service-oriented, business service-oriented businesses where my customers would care about extra, having extra knowledge, or I'm providing a service that is recurring. I'm going to keep coming back to this business and learn more about that business, learn more about that product, and so I'm looking for education. And so that's where I think marketing of a podcast really makes a lot of sense. One of the podcasts that we produce is for a music venue. And that music venue obviously wants to have a recurring customer, right? They want to learn about people who come to that music venue want to learn about the artists that are playing in that music venue. A podcast is a great way to entice someone to purchase a ticket, which is ultimately the product that I'm selling, or buying, food and beer beverages at the venue itself. So that's a good example of my customer is a recurring customer, and my customer will come back if I entice them. So that would be an example of a podcast that would make sense. So those are the questions that I like to present when somebody's exploring this idea of making a podcast. And we want to find as many yeses as we can in that up to these questions. Some of the benefits of podcasting for your business are the podcasting, audio podcasting in particular, is passive. It's passive media consumption. So when you think about making media, and sometimes when we're at this stage of the decision-making process as to whether or not we want to create a podcast, the question is, do I want to make videos or do I want to make audio? Do I want to focus on audio? The benefit of an audio podcast for your business is that it's passive. So I can listen to that podcast while I'm working out. I can listen to it while I'm driving to work every day. I can listen to it while I'm walking the dog. I don't have to be sitting in front of a screen. I don't have to be diverting all of my attention to one place. I can do it in a passive way. So that's an important aspect to think of when you're making a decision. Now, you can certainly create a video podcast and then take the audio and present it also as an audio podcast with several clients who've done that as well in the past effectively. But they are two different things. So that requires more effort. It is not as easy as just saying, well, we'll just do one and scrape that audio and push it out. It's not quite as effective if you're also doing video. And the reason for that is because you ever listen to something and like a television program where you're not actually watching it, but you're listening to it. When people are creating video, they don't necessarily describe all of the things that are happening. So they might make a face, where they might say, show a picture or make some gesture, and the audience, because they're viewing it on video, they see it, right? So you don't have to describe it. So there's a difference there. But audio podcasts they sort of level the playing field in terms of your possible reach. You obviously have to make very compelling content to reach those audiences, but audio podcasting allows a business to compete in the global marketplace, particularly if you provide remote services. And one of the most important things, and most important benefits of this type of media production is something people don't often think about. You don't really need a big audience to have a big impact on your business, especially if the type of business that you have is, we'll say, the type of business where the unit that you're selling, the product or service, is a high dollar unit. You're not expecting to sell a lot. So in the consulting space, for example, I've worked in software consulting for many, many years. One client, you spend a lot of time selling to one particular client, but one particular client can have a huge impact on your bottom line. So you don't have to do, it's not like you're selling cups of coffee, right? Where you need to sell a lot of cups of coffee to make a lot of money. In some industries, you don't need to sell that many units, right? So if you can create an audio podcast that's compelling, and you can from that audio podcast maybe acquire one or two new clients. Those one or two new clients can have a huge impact on your bottom line. So we don't want to think about audio podcasting in the space of business as something that needs to be viral, right? It's not, we don't care about numbers in this space. I'm more concerned about qualified audience members. I'm more concerned about creating content that will draw in the customers that I need, not 1.5 million listeners, for example. So that's a very important aspect of when thinking about should I create a podcast. And second, it's about the narrative itself, controlling the narrative. So when you create a podcast for your business, you get to position yourself as an expert. You get to bring in the guests or your colleagues that you work with and position them as experts. And you can present that to your audience, right, in a way. They could have a huge impact on your sales and marketing. Podcasts allow you to create community and allows you to network with others. I know in the software business over the years, I have created podcasts for that industry, and I've been the guest on podcasts in that industry. Both of them can have a big impact on your business and on the services that you provide. So you can network with other people in your industry as long as it's an industry that's non-competitive in the sense that maybe it's geographical, and you can use your platform to network. Some industries in the IT business, for example, there are many components to IT. And I might be an expert in networking, and I might have a colleague or a friend who's an expert in hardware. I can have a podcast about IT, and I can bring my colleague or another partner who actually has a different business and promote them as well as promoting myself. So it's a great platform for that sort of thing, for creating a narrative to position yourself as an expert. I'd like to open up for some questions. I know that on Zoom we've had some chatter. So I'm going to stand by here for just a second and see what kind of questions have come in.
The only one was whether or not it was available online, yeah, or whether the slideshow would be available.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely. We'll provide that to SCORE to post that and send it out to members or to anybody who participated. Yeah. Do you have any questions from in the room?
What's that picture back there, Jason?
This picture is Bethlehem Steel Company, the Lebanon plant.
Yeah, that's looking at that all morning. So
There you go. Excellent question. Thank you. I'm not sure what year.
Many years ago.
This is a photograph from many years ago.
there somebody online with a question?
I'm curious, what is the cost if a company went a professional route and they talked to me a little bit more about the relative cost?
Relative cost. So the question was relative cost of having a studio
Mhm.
publishing podcast. Of course, just like any service that's a creative service like that, it depends on the complexity of the podcast. But to give you kind of an idea, as far as the production part of the podcast, we usually try to estimate out the production part based on our studio. And then it might be a couple $100 to use that studio to record an episode, again, depending on the length of the recording. And then post-production services usually scale that up in terms of the approximate length of the podcast. So you can do a 15-minute podcast, or we might say a 30-minute podcast, or up to an hour-long podcast. And that usually would fluctuate somewhere between like maybe $50 editing, right, on a solo voice, simple 10 or 15-minute podcast, all the way up to $200 or $300 an episode for a longer form podcast where we're editing multiple voices. So yeah, usually put together a package based on the approximate number of podcasts in a season, and then work through that budget and then update that budget.
I appreciate that, certainly reasonable.
Yeah. Try not to break the bank, but try to provide those services.
When you look at podcasts, what percentage are audio and video versus just audio?
Oh, it's a great question. So the question was what percentage would be audio versus audio and video? I don't have numbers on that, but I will say that Spotify, for example, Spotify, a very popular platform for distributing, purchased what's called Anchor hosting years ago. Anchor, I think it's a couple years ago or last year. Anchor hosting is a very popular third-party hosting platform. And Spotify bought Anchor, and if you are publishing through Anchor, they will allow you to publish video through Spotify, right? So it's distributed the same way that a regular audio podcast would be, but if you have a video component to that podcast, you can actually view the video directly through the Spotify app, which I think is going to change. That's a relatively new development. We're starting to see that more and more. And so I think those numbers are going to it's going to increase on the video side. Because what's happening is, and very famous podcasters like Joe Rogan, you probably hear his name in the news quite a bit because there was some controversy around Joe Rogan. Arguably one of the more successful podcasters, somebody who started an independent program as a comedian, and over the years it has grown to where he signed some ridiculously insane deal with Spotify a few years ago, right? So published. What Joe Rogan would do is throw a couple cameras up in the studio and essentially record an audio podcast and video tape. So there's a difference between making a marketing video where you're intentionally making a video series versus just just so happen to have cameras up while you're recording your audio podcast. There's a different look to it, there's a different feel to it, there's a different purpose for it. And so we're seeing a lot more of that, where instead of making a short 5-10 minute video series on YouTube, where I don't look like I'm recording a podcast, maybe I'm using a lapel mic, right? Maybe I'm sitting in a studio, I look more like a television program. You see more and more and more of I'm creating an audio podcast and I'm sitting in front of a microphone with headphones on, so I look like I'm in a radio studio, and that's being video recorded. And that type of video is what's really being pushed out now through Spotify to complement these audio podcasts. You want to watch the guest, right? And I would argue that that's going to be very, very popular in celebrity podcasts. Like we're celebrity because people want to see the celebrities that they follow, in person, and having that conversation. But I'm not sure what the difference is in terms of numbers, but it's on the rise for sure. Video.
So you said, not to get in anybody's way here, but you used pizza as an example. Maybe that's not the best vehicle, okay? Podcast.
Right.
Do you have customers come to you that like that and you say, wait a minute, this may not be the best for your business? or do you take them through the whole series of questions that we talked about earlier?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Through the co-working space, through the Candy Factory in Lancaster, we also provide services to our members. So, and we provide what are called ideation sessions. And these ideation sessions are anybody who has an idea. Anybody who has an idea about a media project, whether it be an audio podcast or a video podcast or a video project, they can come as a member of the co-working space and walk through this ideation process and determine whether or not they should do it and what equipment or skills they will need to acquire in order to do it. And that process is what we use as a baseline. And so, yeah, we've had several people come through and say, well, I was thinking about doing this, making a podcast or making a marketing video series. And once we get through the process, it's like, I don't really know if this is going to be effective.
So what if I'm not a member of the Candy Factory? Is there, I can use your slides here, take
Sure.
me through this. Any other place I can?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can contact us and come to us at So Good Media. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to ask you about your project. And part of that would be a discovery process. We get together and we chat about it, and we'll use that as a baseline, that process to walk through. Make sure that it's a good fit. Make sure that it's something you want to do. And importantly, too, determine whether or not there are pieces of this project that you want to do yourself, or that you maybe have other folks who can, other resources you can use them. And there's a lot of moving parts to creating these types of assets. And so we have a full mix. The music venue client that I mentioned earlier actually records their own audio in their venue with the artists. Often, if they can't catch the artist, if it's a touring artist, they will record that artist when they're in town. If they're a local artist, then they'll have them come in a month or so before the concert and sit down and do an interview and talk to them then. And then they just hand off that raw audio recording and let us handle the post-production. That's a case where there's actually, it's cool to have that being recorded in the space. Because if they're doing it, especially when there's people, you hear the murmur in the background, you hear the energy in the space. So there's a lot of different pieces to it, and sometimes it makes more sense to have somebody else or the business itself take care of the piece of that. We're gonna walk through that whole process and figure out which pieces make the most sense for the, who should handle each piece of that process. And whether or not it's a good idea.
Yeah.
To begin with. You may be better served as writing a blog post at the end of the day. For the impact. Or posting, pizza. Having photographs of your pizza on social media probably kind of makes you want to eat it. You know what I mean? More than listening to you talk about it.
So if I had a business that wasn't a pizza shop, if I had a yoga studio,
Okay,
I could make an audio in the studio with some of my clients
sure,
and then send it to you or another media type company
absolutely.
to do the post-production.
That's correct.
And now the question, I'm going to follow up Diane, what would something like that cost?
Well, again, I think it depends on the length amount of time it's going to take to edit it, how many voices it's all going to be relative to that. But we try to do a per episode at somewhere around the $200 or $300 range plus or minus. Like we're, an audio, a project where we're editing audio that is somewhere in the 30-minute plus or minus 50-minute range is going to think about, you can usually think of it as about 3 times the length of the actual media.
Okay.
If you think about effort, right?
Okay.
So if I take a 30-minute piece, right, it's going to take me a couple of hours to edit that piece. If you give me 6 hours, it's going to take me a few days.
Yeah. Okay.
Not a lot of 6-hour podcasts.
Okay.
Podcast episodes, right? So yeah, for sure. Are you thinking about opening a yoga studio?
I might.
Thinking about it? Okay, consider it. Any questions from Zoom? There was chatter, but I guess there weren't any questions. Yes.
So how do you know if your podcasts are effective, and how do you know when to change direction to try something different because people aren't as engaged?
So yeah, the question is how do you know how effective? Let me talk just a minute about publishing the podcast. We didn't get into the details of that in this talk, but I'll just keep it at a high level. Publishing a podcast requires the podcast to be posted on the internet. You can either self-post that on your own website. Most website platforms have a component or a module that allows you to do that. Or you can use a third-party hosting company, and this would be like I mentioned, Anchor. And as one, or Podbean, there's several out there. You can just Google hosting podcasts. Those third-party hosting companies or the add-ons or the modules on your own website, typically, depending on which one you purchase, typically come with a statistics component. Some you have to pay a little bit extra for to get detailed statistics, but across the board, it's fairly standard, right? So you can start to track your listens immediately when you start to publish a podcast. And the metrics are typically what platforms they're listening through. So what aggregators I mentioned earlier, Apple, Google, Spotify, what kind of device they're listening on. So if you can find out that most of your audience is listening on a mobile phone versus a computer, that's important information as well, right? Those statistics then you can use to find out whether or not people are actually listening to the podcast, step number one. Then step number two would be, who cares? If a bunch of people are listening to this podcast, but they're not buying my product or service, why am I spending the money or the effort to do this? So I kind of think of this like, email marketing, when you think about newsletters. For 2 decades now, right? We've been sending email newsletter. Are they effective? Well, we're still sending out email newsletters. They are effective. How do you track that? Well, you see a lot of clicks and a lot of opens. At the end of the day, you have to have some kind of mechanism just for your business as a whole to determine where those customer referrals are coming from. They can be anecdotal. Hey, I heard you on your podcast, or they can be, I've been getting your newsletter for years and I finally had a need, so I reached out to you. Or they can be a little bit more statistical, like you're capturing, how did you hear about us? On some sort of a form or sign-up form, or when they engage with your product or service, asking them directly, how did you hear about us? And including your podcast is one of those options, right? Is really the metric there. But podcasts are a lot like email newsletters in the sense that it's a seed plant, right? I generally call marketing really when you think about it, but it plants a seed. If you're creating compelling content and you're providing some value, right? It's standard content marketing. You're providing some value and you're engaging somebody and they want to come back and they want to listen to your podcast over and over again. You may not benefit from that seed that was planted for weeks or months or even years, but it can still come back. And that's something I did gloss over this in the presentation. One of the benefits of any content marketing is the idea of evergreen content. So a podcast, if done really properly and well, can be evergreen, which means that you will benefit from that for years to come. It's not time specific like a social media post. So we do coach our podcast clients to make sure that they don't focus too much on the present moment. I will edit out references to the weather. I will, if someone's talking about how hot it was this week, well, that just might not play that well in the winter, right? You want to keep that very neutral, right? Someone might not stumble upon your podcast for 6 months. And so I want to create the most effective, taking that example just one step further, if I find your podcast and I engage in your podcast and I'm listening to it, and you're talking about something that is cutting edge, if I hear something that sort of refers to that this was, I don't know when this was done, this might have been recorded years ago, I may not be as compelled to listen to it or to believe it, right, as I would be if I feel like that it's fresh, even if it was recorded 6 months ago or a year and a half ago. So try to keep things very non-time sensitive for most podcasts for listening. Obviously, my music venue example, we do want to promote the shows that are coming up, so we'll divvy that out to a section, almost like a commercial on part of that podcast, say upcoming, but the core content is we try to be as evergreen as we can be. But yeah, answering the question of how effective it is, very difficult to know, like all marketing, but there are statistics available for the show itself. And then there's anecdotal information and information you can collect when somebody signs up or purchases your product or service.
I would assume the keywords for search on that podcast are really important.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, podcasts are a great way to create blog or SEO content. Not to go down that rabbit hole too far, but business podcasts, there's a great opportunity there to have the audio podcast transcribed and turned into a blog post. And then where that you can listen to it or you can read it. And then that text becomes searchable text on the internet. Yes, sir.
Question. In many of the areas of marketing, we say it needs to be consistent. Don't send out one newsletter
Yeah.
a year, it won't work. Has to be consistent. All right, what about podcasts?
I mentioned earlier that consistency is key regardless of how consistent or not consistent it is. Or how frequent or not frequent it is. You have to be consistent. I think the most obvious schedule for media consumption is weekly, because people are in weekly habits and patterns. But that's just oftentimes just not doable for somebody who's running a small business. So, we find that monthly is perfectly fine as long as you're consistent. So pick a time, pick a day. At the beginning of the first day of the month, or the first Friday of the month, or the first whatever of the month, we're going to release a new episode. And make sure you stick to that. I think twice a month is a nice spot in the middle, right? Of you're not doing 50 episodes a year, but you're also not waiting an entire month to get more content. You release twice a month.
So if I only wanted to do one podcast, I probably should save my money.
You probably should. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend doing a single podcast episode. But you can also let your listeners or your audience know that you're going to do seasons. I mean, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We're kind of used to that. It's another pattern that we're trained in. That again, depending on the industry, that can play even better. Like let's say if you're doing something that specializes in education, a good example might be education technology. And so say I'm a provider of technology that is used in schools. I might not do podcasts in the summer, or maybe there's an argument if my audience are administrators that's a good time to do a podcast, right? But if I'm building a podcast say for teachers who are doing other things through the summer, they might be even doing completely ignoring the work that they're going to be doing, not as focused on it, and that's a good time to take a break. So you could say, I'm going to do a season, and we're going to end that season, in May, and we'll be back in September when the school year kicks in. Where administrators or technology people who might be making business decisions over the summer, that maybe the summer is the best time to do it. So you can do seasons, and you can stay consistent, and then just advertise that, hey, my season's over.
Yeah.
We're going to wrap up this season. Be sure to check out, this whole year's worth of shows or 6 months worth of shows, and we'll see you in September. Yeah.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So when I listen to podcasts, for me, it's a combination of the information that they share, but the personality of the individual providing the podcast. So do you recommend them be more conversational or scripted, or a nice mix of both?
Yeah, again, it goes back to the format, right? What type of podcast? It's the what. Am I going to be a solo voice presenting information? How dynamic is that voice? Do I have a partner that I'm sparring with, or we're having a debate? Am I bringing in guests? Right? It's all about deciding that format and then determine. The best advice that I think I've ever heard, and the best advice that I give is make the podcast you want to listen to. If you don't want to listen to that podcast, you've got work to do, right? It has to be compelling in that way. So you can take your question and you can kind of take it wherever it needs to go. How entertaining should this be? How dynamic should this be? What kind of personality should this be? And wrap that up in, your business, your industry. What do I want to hear? And make that podcast, right? Because if you don't want to listen to it, other people don't want to listen to it, right? Any other questions from the Zoom or here in the room?
And with that, I think we will say thank you to everybody for coming out.
Reach out with any questions.
And thank you for coming along.
Oh, you bet. Thank you.
We will make sure that we send a recording and the slideshow as well, the slide deck as well. So thank you very much and have a great day.